This video provides a brief overview of international sanctions, using Eritrea as a case study. Eritrea was under UN sanctions from 2009 to 2018, including an arms embargo imposed by both the UN and EU, mainly due to allegations of supporting al-Shabaab in Somalia. However, UN expert reports later found no concrete evidence to support these claims, and a 2024 report deemed the accusations baseless. For more details, you can read the full document linked below, which covers additional information not included in the video. Hello and welcome. Today, we're tackling a complex and often controversial topic: international sanctions. We often tend to think of international sanctions as this straightforward pressure tactic. A nation misbehaves, penalties follow, behavior change is simple. But what if that's a drastically oversimplified picture? Boy, it often is. We need to go beyond that surface-level understanding and get into the real mechanics, the often ripple effects, and ask who truly feels the squeeze. While the narrative around sanctions often focuses on targeted actions against specific regimes, the reality on the ground, especially in developing nations, can be far more diffuse and frankly surprising. It forces you to consider when these international levers are pulled, where does the real pressure point lie? So when we talk about sanctions, what are we actually referring to? At their heart, they're international penalties, a tool used by countries or international bodies like the UN or EU to try and compel a nation to change its course. It's like the global community's way of saying, not on our watch, and then backing that up with measures designed to make things more difficult until the concerning actions stop. And it's not just one big hammer, there's a whole toolbox of options. We can broadly categorize these tools. First off, you have economic and financial sanctions. These are all about hitting a country where it hurts financially. Things like freezing assets held in other nations, cutting off access to international banking networks, and generally making it much harder to engage in global commerce. Then you move into trade sanctions, and this is where things can get really intricate. It's not a simple no trading allowed sign. It's a hyper-detailed breakdown of exactly which goods are restricted, what requires special permits, that kind of thing. What's striking is that these lists often drill down to incredibly specific components. You might find that exporting one type of industrial valve is okay, but another with just slightly different technical specifications is prohibited. And this is where the concept of dual-use items comes in. It's like a Swiss Army knife of goods. They have legitimate civilian uses, but could also be adapted for military applications. For example, the UK Strategic Export Control List includes advanced computers under Category 4. Category 4 could be running an office, or it could be guiding a missile. Other examples from these control lists include special metal ingots, Category 1, for manufacturing or weapons. Manufacturing equipment itself, Category 2, which again has both civilian and military applications. Even secure telecoms gear under Category 5. It really makes you think about the sheer complexity for businesses trying to navigate this. Imagine a company that makes a specific type of industrial pump, or maybe certain bearings or seals. They might have no idea that its particular technical features landed it on a restricted list. And the consequences for misstepping are significant. We're talking potentially massive fines, criminal charges for individuals involved, and serious lasting damage to a company's reputation. Being seen to violate export controls can have really long-term repercussions. This leads to what's called a chilling effect. Companies, especially maybe smaller players, without vast legal resources, often become so worried about accidentally crossing a line, they just stop trading altogether. They just stop all trade with the sanctioned country. This overcompliance means that even entirely legitimate trade, maybe goods that might even qualify for humanitarian exemptions, simply doesn't happen. The risk just seems too high. The perceived risk becomes too great. And the sheer range of everyday industrial components that can get caught up is astonishing. You might be surprised what items fall under export regulations. We're talking about things like bearings, seals, all sorts of valves and pumps, electric motors, heat exchangers, various types of piping, compressors, even power converters. And then you get into more advanced stuff like computers, software, robots, sensors, lasers, testing equipment, specialized cables, specific alloys and polymers. The list goes on. And the crucial thing is, it's often about tiny technical details. Specifications, performance capabilities, and materials used can all trigger export controls. The control often hinges on very specific technical criteria: the precision of a bearing, its resistance to corrosion, the performance level of a motor, the exact materials. These can all be determining factors. So beyond the economic and trade stuff, you also have measures like travel bans, restricting specific individuals, usually government officials or military leaders, and asset freezes, targeting the financial holdings of designated people or organizations. And these are often used together, creating this complex web. They rarely operate in isolation. It's usually a combination creating a really intricate and powerful web of pressure. Now that we have a clearer picture of the toolkit, let's look at how these measures actually impact developing nations. Because the stated aim might be pressure on a government, but the reality for the average person can be far more devastating. Remember that question we started with, who really bears the brunt? The economic fallout from broad sanctions in developing countries can be immense. Picture factories being forced to shut down. Why? Because they can't import essential components like those specialized pumps or valves we mentioned, or even high-performance computers, all potentially flagged as dual use. That immediately translates into job losses. Then you see foreign investment just evaporate because of the risk and instability. The local currency can plummet in value, making imports even more expensive, and you get this surge in inflation. Basic necessities, food, fuel, medicine, suddenly become unaffordable for ordinary families. And this economic hardship directly impacts human well-being terribly. There's a real disconnect between the stated goal of targeting regimes and the widespread suffering among civilians. Take healthcare. Many developing nations rely heavily on imported medical equipment. If a crucial piece of equipment breaks down and needs a specific electronic component, maybe a Category 3 dual-use item, or an advanced sensor, Category 6 perhaps, getting those spare parts becomes incredibly difficult, if not impossible. It even affects the production of basic medicines locally. The chemicals needed might face restrictions because of potential dual-use applications. The result is just preventable suffering and death. Tragically, yes, and it disproportionately affects the most vulnerable. Then think about clean water. Fundamental, right? But these systems often depend on imported industrial pumps, valves, water treatment chemicals. If sanctions disrupt maintenance and supply, public health declines inevitably. And food, even if food itself isn't directly sanctioned, restrictions on fuel for transport matter hugely. And fertilizers. Some contain chemicals on control lists, agricultural machinery, or just the lack of funds to pay for imports due to a devalued currency. It all adds up. Widespread food shortages, hunger, and education feels the strain too. Governments facing financial crunches often cut education budgets first. Lack of resources, fewer opportunities for young people, a long-term hit. Now, what about humanitarian exemptions? Theoretically, food and medicine should get through. Right? Theoretically, yes. Most regimes include them on paper. But as we touched on earlier, the practical hurdles could be massive. The bureaucracy in getting licenses, and the reluctance of banks and shipping companies to get involved, fearing they might accidentally violate something, it creates huge obstacles to actually delivering aid. So the exemptions exist, but they don't always work in practice. Sadly, no. Getting essential humanitarian assistance to the people who need it in sanctioned countries can be incredibly challenging. This paints a really stark picture of the potential impact, but the effects aren't always uniform. No, they're not. And to really illustrate this, let's turn our attention to the case of Eritrea. Eritrea provides a really compelling example because it shows that a country's reaction and the ultimate consequences of sanctions can be quite complex, sometimes counterintuitive. They face significant UN sanctions from 2009 to 2018, plus US sanctions later. The UN Security Council imposed them, citing alleged support for al-Shabaab in Somalia and border issues with Djibouti. And the measures were pretty standard. Arms embargo, travel bans, asset freezes. Yes, the usual toolkit. But the Eritrean government strongly denied the accusations. They saw the sanctions as politically motivated and an attack on their sovereignty. They even withdrew from the African Union in protest. But here's the really interesting part. Despite nearly a decade of intense international pressure and isolation, Eritrea's economy didn't collapse like we've seen elsewhere, and a widespread humanitarian crisis was largely averted. Largely averted, yes. This resilience is often attributed to Eritrea's official policy of self-reliance, Warsay Yika Alo, which means it emphasizes mobilizing internal resources, developing domestic capabilities, basically trying to reduce dependence on international trade and foreign aid. And there was a social element too, a very strong one. The government emphasized social cohesion, narratives of social justice, national unity. They fostered this against-the-world mentality and focused on finding indigenous solutions. So national solidarity played a big role. It seems to have been a significant factor in navigating the difficulties. Eritrea stands as an example of how a nation, through self-reliance and unity, can withstand prolonged sanctions. Though their circumstances are unique, of course, but it underscores that the impact isn't always predictable, and countries can find ways to mitigate some negative consequences. Which naturally leads to the question, if broad sanctions have such devastating, often unintended consequences for civilians, are there better ways? Well, this is where the idea of smart sanctions or targeted sanctions comes into play. The aim being more precision, to be much more precise in who and what is being targeted, rather than imposing sweeping measures that hit the entire economy and population. Avoiding the things that cripple civilian industries and infrastructure. The goal is to be more surgical, minimizing harm to the general population while still exerting pressure on those responsible. It's definitely clear that international sanctions are far more complex than they often seem. The unintended consequences, especially for vulnerable people in developing nations, can be profound. And understanding the details like those intricate trade restrictions, the dual-use items, bearings, seals, valves, motors, it really reveals how seemingly small things can have huge knock-on effects, especially on vital sectors like healthcare and water. And the Eritrea experience is a powerful reminder that the impact isn't a foregone conclusion. No, resilience, self-reliance, national unity, these can genuinely play a crucial role. This brings us to a really important point to consider. Given the human cost, the complexities we've discussed, how can the international community develop more effective and more ethical tools for influencing state behavior? That's the key question. Perhaps by really digging into the potential and the limitations of targeted sanctions, and by carefully analyzing the long-term impacts on countries like Eritrea, even after the formal sanctions are lifted. There's still a lot to learn. As we continue to unpack Eritrea's position in the international arena, the influence of media coverage cannot be overlooked. Mainstream reporting on Eritrea is often marked by reductionist narratives, stereotypes, and a lack of contextual understanding, making it difficult to distinguish objective journalism from biased interpretation. In Eritrea's case, errors in reporting tend to consistently portray the country negatively, raising questions about the motivations behind such coverage and underscoring the need for critical analysis of all information sources. There have even been instances where initial media claims were later corrected or debunked by organizations like the United Nations, further highlighting the necessity for skepticism and thorough fact-checking. Amid this landscape of conflicting narratives, rare interviews with Eritrea's president offer a seldom-heard perspective. These interviews provide valuable insights into the nation's internal challenges and policy decisions, serving as an important counterpoint to the dominant external narratives. Such first-hand accounts are crucial, as they help balance the discourse and remind observers that understanding Eritrea requires listening to voices from within the country, not just those of foreign analysts or media outlets who may lack direct experience or linguistic proficiency. In sum, grappling with Eritrea's realities demands a nuanced approach. The country's political complexities, economic constraints, and security priorities cannot be understood through simplistic or one-sided reporting. Instead, forming a comprehensive view requires careful evaluation of multiple perspectives, a critical eye for potential media bias, and an appreciation for the agency and sovereignty of Eritrea's people. The role of international bodies, such as the United Nations, in fact-checking and providing balanced assessments, remains vital in navigating the often conflicting narratives that surround this strategically significant nation. Given the history of contested narratives such as the international response to the now-debunked al-Shabaab story, could new, contested narratives trigger another round of sanctions on Eritrea?
Given the time, I'm going to turn briefly now to Ethiopia and Eritrea. I think we all know that Ethiopia stands at a pretty critical juncture as it grapples with the aftermath of the conflict in Tigray. And as we speak, we see, Eritrea, I think the leader there called up the troops, at least there are reports to that effect. I guess my question for each of you is, if you were in charge right now of U.S. policy, what practical steps would you take today to try to address the bubbling, really almost boiling situation with respect to Ethiopia and Eritrea? Why don't we start with you, Mr. Aservi?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a few key issues here. One is that the Eritreans are still inside of Ethiopian territory in Western Tigray, in violation of the Pretoria Agreement, which is what ended the Tigray War, ostensibly. So there has to be a process for having them leave, but of course their presence is also tied into the internal divisions where the Amhara claim that area, the Tigrayans also claim it. It's a major flashpoint. So I think Right now, what the U.S. can do, and I believe what it did do along with other partner countries, was to unequivocally demonstrate to both sides that we are watching and that a conflict would be unacceptable. And then it should offer its good offices for either convening discussions or trying to mediate around some of these issues. But they are intensely difficult, and I'm not, frankly, terribly positive about the immediate prospects for resolving them.
Thank you. Pastor Gavin.
I would just quickly agree and add that, mobilizing more of the AU member states to insist on actual implementation of the Pretoria Agreement would be a helpful focal point. This is something everybody's already agreed to, but it has not been fully implemented. It's in this strange limbo. And so I think that getting that kind of regional engagement would be helpful.
Thank you, Bill.
Against this backdrop, it is important to ask, has anyone actually seen recent, credible reports confirming the presence of military forces in Western Tigray? Are the policy analysts briefing the U.S. Senate and Congress truly in touch with the realities on the ground? Or is there a persistent disconnect between their analysis and the situation as it unfolds? Could it be that the circumstances are more complex and less clear-cut than some reports suggest? Specifically, is it accurate to assert that foreign troops, particularly Eritrean forces, remain inside Ethiopian territory in Western Tigray? Should we anticipate another round of sanctions on Eritrea based on unverified or incomplete information? Ultimately, are we at risk of returning to square one, repeating cycles of misunderstanding and reaction, rather than moving toward a more informed and balanced engagement with Eritrea and the region as a whole? What are your thoughts on this complex issue? Do you think sanctions are a necessary evil, an ineffective tool, or something else entirely? Share your perspective respectfully in the comments below. If you found this discussion valuable, share it to help others think critically about the real-world impact of sanctions.